For today's episode, we're featuring a discussion between Samo and I about the demographic crisis and its potential implications for the future of humanity. This is a sobering exploration of plummeting birth rates worldwide, from expected places like Japan to surprising ones like Iran and India, and takes a provocative turn as we explore a range of scenarios, including the potential for civilizational collapse, human extinction, and the rise of artificial intelligence. This episode is a must-listen for anyone interested in the future of humanity, technology, and the social forces that shape our world.
Let's get into it. I mean, we talked about demographic issues in specific countries like India or China or some others.
Even Japan, and I mentioned it in Poland and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, and typically, of course, people are like, immigration. But if we have it on a global scale, we need people from somewhere. So maybe let's have a broader conversation around demographics and the fertility crisis and underpopulation. Why don't you, when you start us off?
I think that I will open with a provocation. We have no known demographic or cultural force that kicks in and stops us from reaching the TFR zero society. Now, would I bet that there will be a TFR zero society in the next century? I tend to be an optimist. I tend to say that we will figure this out and we will push in the other direction and something else will happen. However, I think that if those activists who warn us of the reality of global warming can indulge in hyperbole of how this might, end the world as we know it, I think that demographic changes that have already underwent are certain to end the world as we know it. The only question is, will they end the world, the human world, full stop? I have not heard anyone refer to, basically, at least not in public, to the ongoing demographic contraction and drop in fertility rates happening globally as a source of existential risk. Just as much as nuclear war or AI, it should be considered in the same category. Let me make the case. Until very recently, people assumed that fertility would plateau at a very low 1.1 total fertility rate. This is what we used to see in places like South Korea. Places like Japan that are famous for their old population and low fertility, at 1.3, Japan's actually now a middle fertility country. Japan's no longer an outlier. If anything, it's slowed down relatively to other countries accelerating their fertility decline. So in a way, for East Asia, Japan is now a high fertility country, and globally it's a middling fertility country. But once you break this barrier of TFR of 1.0, as they have in South Korea, and gone as low as 0.7, or if you take Hong Kong on its own, its TFR right now is like 0.5. And if we looked at the other major Chinese cities, if the Chinese Communist Party released accurate data, I bet we would see numbers worse than Hong Kong. We would see numbers like 0.3 or 0.2 if they weren't adulterated or messed with. Let's be real. If we have cities in the world that have tens of millions of people, so nation-sized, already seeing fertility of 0.3, 0.2, Erik, how long is it before we see a 0.1 city? And how long before we see a city that it's not going to be literally 0.0, but could it be like 0.02 or 4? I think it's just insane that no one's thinking that. Everyone's assuming this must bounce back. Everyone's assuming it must stop. Yet now we're seeing it truly everywhere, right? We talked about it in India, which is a very poor country, a very young country. We talked about it in Eastern Europe. That's like middle income, sometimes very poor, depending on the country, also low fertility. We talked about it in Japan, in America, in Britain. It's truly happening everywhere.
And is there any country that has gotten below replacement rate in a serious way and then has bounced back to the degree that they've kind of made up for it? And that might be the wrong way of thinking about that, even because it's time dependent. You can't just make up for it, in time maybe. But have we seen significant bounce backs or not really?
Well, we have seen significant bounce backs in a few places. I think that if you look at Eastern Europe, you will see that their fertility started crashing with the end of communism, reached very, very low rates even after the economy started improving. And then around 2007-8, they achieved, the lowest fertility on record happened for those countries, or second lowest. After that, they recovered. not above replacement, but they recovered from 0.2 or 0.3 up to 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 even. Some of them have seen a second decline after the COVID years and now the post-COVID years. The decline, by the way, is continuing. It wasn't just during the social isolation, but if anything, it seems to be accelerating. There are a number of countries who, to everyone's surprise, have now crashed below replacement, such as Turkey. People were not expecting Turkey to be so below replacement so quickly because, again, Turkey is middle income by global standards, low income, low wealth by European standards still. So I think that historically, we did have a few cases. For example, the baby boom after World War II remains largely unexplained. There are numerous countries that did not have a baby boom. However, the United States and France did. France returned above replacement due to the baby boom. I also believe Germany was below replacement at some time and rose above replacement briefly in the same period. So most stories, by the way, for the baby boom is it's good to win a war. And then, you can argue, the US clearly won a war. You can argue that France won the war. That's already a sort of weird argument. You can't really argue West Germany won the war. So, and then if you say, oh, but it's economic expansion that causes an increase in fertility, well, that sounds on paper like it makes sense, but it's the opposite of what we say about countries in the 1990s and 2000s. I think we just have to accept the truth that we don't understand fertility. And look, there are just so few outliers. We're literally talking about, okay, among countries we could class as high income or middle income, I think we have I think Armenia, it's either Armenia or Georgia, and then there's Israel. And Israel's fertility has also gone down, by the way, to be clear. But Israel has a healthy fertility despite being a modern country. Maybe we can learn something from it, but what are you going to do? Just cargo cult and just copy everything Israel does? It's unlikely to work. I don't think we actually know why Israel is, for now, still an outlier. Note, an outlier might just mean that in the sort of distribution of fertility, it's going to take a bit longer, right? Maybe people are temporarily super motivated by what's basically an existential fight. I could tell that story, by the way. But if I'm telling that story, then why are the Ukrainians not having 3 babies? The Ukrainians seem no less patriotic or nationalist than the Israelis, to be honest, right? And they're also fighting an existential war. So where are their babies? It's really hard to tell a coherent theory, even for these few outliers or cases where we have bounce back that we see.
And is the best explanation for why this happens is just that as modernity hits a society, the opportunity cost for women to have kids increases, and thus they rather kind of do other stuff, and what do you think is the best explanation?
I mean, let's say, yeah, sure, that makes sense. Maybe the rest of our lives are just very interesting, like both men and women. And then maybe for women, especially, they're liberated and led into the workforce. I feel the first argument is almost a stronger argument. I've heard this from some of the progress studies people and some of the Institute for Progress people. I feel like they're the professional Panglossians of our era, right? All is well. The Big Mac is good for you. You like it. You enjoy it. You want to eat it. I feel like that's their job to say that. And maybe I'll put in a good word for cigarettes and nicotine and caffeine, though I don't smoke. But you're not going to catch me defending Diet Coke is the greatest drink ever invented and peak of human experience. You're just not going to hear me do that. And we both have lots of friends, nothing wrong if you like it, but people were memeing about it, if you remember. So I feel like when they make some of their guys, I forget who, on Twitter make this argument, oh, modern life has just gotten so good that we're enjoying it so much that raising babies just doesn't seem as fun. I'm like, well, what is your opinion on North Korea? Has North Korean life gotten so much better over the last 30 years that all the North Korean women are so happy with their career and earning opportunities and opportunities to contribute to North Korean society that has tanked their TFR? It seems super unlikely, right? At least if that's the main thing driving it. It just seems like extremely unlikely explanation.
I don't know anything about North Korea. Did they have feminism?
Well, okay. Let me propose. While I'm sure Western propaganda exaggerates it, it's like one of the few truly totalitarian societies in the world, and their economy is like sucks. It's like super demoralizing to be in the workplace because you're under political threat, and economically you don't make a lot of money. Sorry, Erik. I don't want to be too neurodiverse here, but I thought I would say that explicitly for the audience.
If that's the case, why is their TFR collapsed? Have they had just a yeah?
I mean, not even to interrupt, but because I think we just don't know. And that's the scariest. Can you imagine if the planet was warming every year and we didn't know there was CO2 emissions? I bet people would be way more worried about it. I don't even think we'd be partisan about it. I think we'd all be panicking and we'd be funding climate science to figure it out and starting to like seriously look at geoengineering to cool it. It's only because we have tied the warming of the planet to carbon specifically has it become like a proxy referendum for the car-centric, AC-centric, suburban lifestyle, and to a much lesser extent, the oil industry and the Middle East and all of these things. But for some reason on fertility, I don't know. I think we're not, we pretend to know why it's declining. And we have good stories, which is that human life is getting so much better. And maybe a story where, the planet can't support this many of us, so there should be fewer of us. Or what's actually an extremely, eugenicist argument, but that everyone loves to make, both left and right. It's sort of like, well, it's good that the population is shrinking because the wrong people were reproducing anyway, right? Like that's an argument you hear in comment sections. I see it all the time. And I just don't think it's true. I think by most metrics, it doesn't matter if you hate the overeducated liberal or if you hate the undereducated jokel and you think it's good for humanity that either of these groups kind of stops reproducing. It doesn't matter because like both of them are failing to reproduce, and especially even the people in the middle. Okay, the only community that currently in the United States has really good TFR, there are like two. One is the literal billionaires. So if you are a literal billionaire, you will have above replacement fertility. And that's not even due to Elon like juicing the numbers. That's just normal, very wealthy Americans tend to have above replacement. And it's such a tiny proportion of the population. Them, and it's like the Amish. Not even the Amish and the Mormons, by the way. Mormon fertility has collapsed. And for now, Amish fertility is like, it's not clear if it's noise in the data or if it's declining slowly. But let's play out this world where everyone goes below replacement except the Amish. And then 1,000 years from now, the result isn't that the Amish control the United States of America. The result is that North America and South America and small parts of Europe, the Amish also have been resettling and buying some parts of Europe, are settled by humans. And the humans do 18th century farming, and maybe they've kept tractors. That's at the very least a complete collapse of the industrial base. Erik, I guarantee you the Amish will like not be working at TSMC. Like they're not going to be doing that. And if they start doing that, their fertility is going to go way down. And I like modern technology. I'm not anti it. So that seems scary. Even if the humans technically survive because of the Amish and the Adamantese Islanders, the uncontacted tribes of, Brazil and the Indian Ocean islands.
We basically established that this is happening globally, nearly everywhere, for reasons we can't exactly understand. And countries have tried different interventions, and nothing has really worked in a durable or repeatable way. So should we be hopeless? Basically, should we just accept that in the next, generation, we're going to have, a significantly underpopulated society from what we have now? Like people were always like, oh, there'll be 9 billion people by X date. But should we accept a world where there's 6 billion, 5 billion,
When I looked into this with my team, our conclusion was that by the end of the century, there will be fewer than 1 billion Indians. So from South Asia. And I bet that if we looked at some of these other places, we would arrive at similar results. In some places, even the population explosion was exaggerated, like in the case of Nigeria. There's like strong evidence that the individual states are juicing their population numbers because there's no nationwide census. However, federal oil money is distributed within Nigeria on a key based on the population of a state. So there was a decade-long incentive to exaggerate population and population growth, and a blocking of the federal government just counting the people in the country. So it was kind of states got to self-report how many people live there, and the more people that live there, the more oil revenue the elites got in that state. So that's pretty straightforward. And then in China, I think the Communist Party, this is one of the few things that Zaihan gets right. They have been incentivized to paper over just how disastrous the one-child policy is. So I bet they're currently exaggerating their fertility numbers significantly. Even though, by the way, it's been a few years since they stopped the policy and fertility didn't rebound. Now, to answer your question, and to why was I raising Nigeria and these other countries, it was to say I'm not even sure we're going to hit 9 billion. Like, I think currently it's we're 8 billion people, 8.5 maybe. I would not be surprised that if we could completely accurately count world population, that it doesn't peak like slightly above 9 billion. It might on paper due to China, Nigeria, and other places. Let me check. Yeah, current world population is apparently, as of 2022, it was 7.95 billion. So we currently believe it to be over 8 billion. I'm not even sure it's going to ever go actually to 9 billion. And if it does, very soon after, I think it's going to fall. And this is much more pessimistic than the UN projections. You could look at these graphs. Year after year, the official population estimates look like, fertility goes up and then it goes down and then it stabilizes. And this latter part is always fiction. It's just always fiction. But even after every year, the peak gets lower and the fall gets faster, they just keep drawing a line that surely this will stabilize. It might, but I don't think it's going to happen automatically. I actually think it's not going to happen automatically.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hi, it's Erik. If you're looking to take a deeper dive into international affairs and business strategies, then I highly recommend listening to the new podcast, Dealcraft, Insights from Great Negotiators. Recently called a best podcast pick by The Guardian, Dealcraft features interviews with the world's greatest dealmakers and diplomats, including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Blackstone's Steve Schwarzman, and music industry super lawyer John Branca on their most challenging negotiations. Each episode, host Jim Sebenius, Harvard Business School professor and renowned negotiation expert, shares fascinating deal stories and distills useful insights for listeners to apply in their toughest deals and disputes. New episodes release weekly and explore everything from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's negotiations with Vladimir Putin to how Costa Rican diplomat Cristina Figueres saved the Paris climate talks. So don't miss out. Follow Dealcraft, Insights from Great Negotiators on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For back-end, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
What is your sort of assumption as it relates to life expectancy? And as you think about your projection, are you expecting that to stay the same? Are you expecting it to increase? Is that meaningful?
I think that on the margin, we are going to live longer than ever before with, I think, health spans, especially if we continue developing anti-obesity drugs. That's the important part, because the world has gotten very fat. Like, for example, India and Mexico have greater obesity problems now than the United States, which is crazy to consider, right? Like more trouble with diabetes and so on. But because of that, that is the great shortening of health span. As people have gotten much fatter, their health span has contracted. Note, in the United States, Do you know what's been happening to life expectancy for the last few years? It's been dropping.
It's been decreasing.
It's been dropping.
Why is that? Health-related issues?
It's basically, if you don't have diabetes, if you're not a drug addict, if you don't kill yourself, and suicides have been high, by the way, suicides have been increasing. And if you're not overweight, well, that's why I said that I think that the anti-obesity drugs will, once introduced into the United States, Europe, which has also been getting fatter, though slower, and East Asia, where, by the way, in China, people are for the first time having an obesity problem, but also India and Mexico and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, I think these drugs will extend health span. So I think that by the end of this century, I predict that the focus on health and well-being will mean that people in their 50s and 60s will look closer to the way people in their 40s look today. And they'll feel more energetic and they'll be younger. I don't think we will make very much progress on slow aging-related cognitive decline. So while 60-year-olds might look like 40-year-olds today, they will be slightly dimmer than 40-year-olds today. Now, of course, in many professions, actually, crystallized intelligence outdoes fluid intelligence. However, the intelligence of the population, the average intelligence, surely matters. Let us remember, a global graying implies also the world becoming stupider, or at least more forgetful. And I'm not even talking about Alzheimer's, I'm just talking about non-Alzheimer's related age decline and ability to adapt, right? So, yeah. I mean, maybe that missed your question, but there's so many, there's so many threads we can pull on this where the prognosis is super negative. I do think it's worth talking about healthcare. Like, if I were to find a silver lining to this, to the silver-haired global population, I think for the first time ever, we're going to have a database that's going to have the health statistics of 400 million 90-year-olds. I'm not even sure there have been 400 million 90-year-olds in like all of human history. I don't know what the current global number is. It probably is like a few million. We could ask, one of the AIs how many there are. But I think even if there are a few million, we've not collected data on them as a demographic because they're not consumers. Now, in Japan, we saw this shift where as Japan grayed, the market for adult diapers and alternate care and like various forms of automation for like beds that like move you out of the bed automatically and stuff like that, there was a market for that. So I think the pharmaceutical industry will have hundreds of millions of customers who want solutions to these terrible old age diseases. Now, because of this, I could see global, assuming the suicide thing doesn't get even worse, which is a big if, and assuming we solve obesity through basically pharmaceutical means globally, I think that we might see people reaching 100, like living to 100 and being healthy and active and working until they're like late 60s, right? Maybe up to 70 for people with good genetics, with lucky genetics, I should say. All genetics, almost every phenotype you see in the population has advantages and disadvantages, right? The same gene that might make you an Olympic powerlifter might actually mean that, at 70, you're going to have bone issues or something like that.
Yeah.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Have you heard of this alternative investing company, alts.co? The idea behind it is simple. There are a million syndicates out there that co-invest in startups or real estate. But what about alternative investments? Where do you go if you want to invest in, say, Hollywood film financing deals, or a dozen barrels of tequila, or pro sports teams? There's a world of alternative investments out there, and boy, these guys are all over it. Their community, Altea, is a place for forward-thinking investors to invest in unique, vetted deals, meet captivating people, and enjoy once-in-a-lifetime travel experiences. Apply to join Altea. Who knows where things might lead? Travel, meet unique people, invest in asset classes that are a bit out of your usual lane. This is what Altea gives you. Unique, slightly uncomfortable, but incredibly rewarding experiences which not only help your portfolio, but stretch your mind and allow you to see the world differently. Check these guys out at alts.co/zen. That's alts.co/zen. alts.co/zen. You like to optimize things. You've chosen the perfect credit card to maximize your travel points, and you always find the fastest route when you drive. Shouldn't you handle your charitable giving the same way? Givewell spends 50,000 hours every year doing deep dives into different charitable programs to try to find the ways to do the most good for your dollar. Givewell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used Givewell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. It's easy to see why the Boston Globe called Givewell the gold standard for giving. Givewell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and Givewell doesn't take a cut. Go to givewell.org to find out more or make a donation. Select podcast and enter Econ102 at checkout to make sure they know you heard about them from us. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.
So circling back a little bit, are there any interventions that we're excited about? People, think about tax benefits, childcare, these things that kind of on the margins, right? Tax credits or whatever. But should we be having a Manhattan Project for increasing the population? How big of a priority should we be making getting back to, should Elon have 1,000 or thousands? Should Elon spark a narrative, sort of a movement of all these rich people having, more kids, almost like factory style, just because we need babies? How severe is this potential crisis, and what should be done about it?
I think I'm raising the alarm right now, somewhat provocatively, because I think it is possible that this might lead to human extinction or civilizational collapse. I was already worried about civilizational collapse for a variety of reasons in our civilization 10 years ago. But I have to admit, I personally assumed that low fertility would stay a Western problem. I didn't actually assume they would affect the third world, at least not until it became rich. But that's not what happened. And that's been one of the biggest surprises of my adult intellectual life. In a way, I priced in AI progress because I was reading, it was better back then, but I was reading Less Wrong back in 2009, 10, 11, Overcoming Bias, all of that stuff. No one was predicting a global fertility decline. Lots of people were saying, oh, maybe feminism is the problem, and maybe Islam will overtake us all. But, no one was saying, oh, actually, Turkey and eventually places like Egypt are going to be low fertility too. No one was saying that. So I would say that we should be very concerned, and we should try many different things. I commend Hungary for having tried significant tax breaks for people with children. I think now is the right time to push for tax breaks for families. The reason is the old people haven't yet realized that they're socialists. Okay, baby boomers in America still think that they basically benefit from the free market. They don't realize that society is structurally more and more in the future going to be built towards transferring to the old from the young, because the young work and the old vote. So if you have that set up, that surely goes towards massive wealth transfers some way or another. So right now, I think, I could cite the article, Who is Portugal For? That was published by Vasco Queiroz in Palladium magazine, where he points out that, in Portugal, that's already happened. The old, who are now such a big part of the population, reliably vote for pensions and various other benefits for the old, right? So that is definitely the case there already. Portugal is a bit ahead of the US, partially because of immigration, partially because until 2010, America was a religious country. I don't think it is very much today, but back in the early 2000s, the US was an exception. It had a large population of Christians, also observant Jews and so on, which Europe did not, right? And East Asia did not. And they had higher fertility. Now, the culture warriors of, the center left can congratulate themselves. The new atheist fight has been won. Young Americans are about as secular as young Europeans. However, as a side effect, that little fertility bump went away. And, I don't think, by the way, staying religious is a solution. It's just staying religious helps. it's like your decline is slower and you still have more babies than the people who are religious. And, this effect can be pretty extreme together with a radically different lifestyle, as seen in the case of the Amish. But I don't think it's just that the Amish are that much more pious than Iranian Muslims. I think it's just the case that the lifestyle is very different, right? The Iranian Muslims, they might have bearded policemen harassing underdressed women in the street, but they live a modern lifestyle, including the women, right? The women go to university, have PhDs, the men work office jobs. And, the bearded men policing the women, they're not members of your clan or something. They're just literally the national religious police. So it's kind of like, it's a weirdly modern state, and perhaps one worth an episode to discuss. Like, how does Iran work, right? Recently, Iran was in the news with the missile barrage of Israel. Yeah, perhaps we should have an Israel and Iran 2 episodes. Yeah, we never avoid controversy. I think we're going to go right into it. Yeah, so I think we could be thinking about, like, first off, we should publicly praise people with a lot of babies. I think we should make it clear that having babies is, like, first off, it's like patriotic. Secondly, it's good for society. Third, it's good for us keeping a liberal society, because at the end of the day, if the highest fertility countries are the illiberal countries, and the illiberal countries can stop their people from moving into liberal countries, which, by the way, for example, North Korea, right? It doesn't have a high fertility, but it certainly stops people from leaving, doesn't it? Right? And I bet China, if it were to try very hard, could stop people leaving China pretty effectively. So in that world, those countries are just going to have more fighting age young men, and they're going to have a better economy than we do. And, like, that's the reason, it's like, sure, the immigration question, it's like, fine. Though I have to ask, if a Nigerian moves from Nigeria, where they would have had 6 babies, and they move to the United States and they have 3 babies, and then their babies have 1.5 babies each, this is, like, good for the United States. It's probably good for the Nigerian as family. It's probably not good for Nigeria, because they probably lost a smart fraction person. And it's certainly not good for global population, right? So if we could magically move half of Africa into Europe and America, the result wouldn't be that there will be a higher global population at the end of the century. The result would be a much lower global population at the end of the century. So I just want to make that point, that not only is that while immigration is a solution to stay ahead if you do it smart, though of course Canada, France, Sweden demonstrate what happens when you do it not smart, then it's a detriment. Britain recently. It is actually globally a negative if what you're trying to do is keep global population at least stable rather than collapsing, right? So we have to look again at fertility intervention. These can be tax breaks. I think tax breaks are excellent because, let's be real, I think parents, when they raise their children, it used to be like, they're producing more mouths to feed. These children are going to get welfare. All the welfare is going to be going to the old people. That's how the political economy works. They're doing work. Anyone who's raising their children to be, like, decent, like, peaceful, economically productive, entrepreneurial, smart people, they're doing a society such a big favor. They're giving positive externalities to all of those of us who choose to be childless. So I think the liberal argument, the liberal social argument for having tax breaks for families is there. And I wish my center-left friends would, like, listen to my center-right friends about this, because it really doesn't have to be a culture war issue. We could just do it, right? We could just do it, and we'll help on the margin. It's helping Hungary a little bit. It's too expensive for Hungary. But, I bet if the US did this, it would work better, because the US is richer and you earn more personally. So the tax break is actually more money. I don't think we're ever going to drag Homo economicus by the collar towards reproducing. I think Homo economicus is sort of, oh God, I could be so spicy. Let me just say, lots of animals do not breed in captivity. So if your main motivation is financial gain, I think you are in a form of captivity.
Yes. What means? Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. What means exactly. Right. Maybe slaves were also Homo economicus, right? Except under coercion.
Yeah. And so I want to zoom back out to when you say, hey, this could lead to the result of human extinction. Like, on what timeline, or what is the timeline that we should be worried about? Because you mentioned, hey, we might still have 1 billion Indians. which is,
that's plenty.
Yeah, concerning, but not human extinction. So why don't you talk about what is the default case of if things don't change, how is this going to play out?
Well, let's talk about it. Because it really depends on how rapidly we're going. I think if the fertility drop like literally stops this year, I'm relieved. In that case, we're going to have billions of people at the end of the century. Technology can progress. The global economy might not grow very much, even if AI goes ahead and leaps and bounds. If the world's population is smaller at the end of this century, we might also be poorer. Like we should factor that in, and I can talk through the economics of that. Because as long as AI doesn't automate everything, more people does make you wealthier, right? Because what is it? Jevons paradox is the term in economics, I believe, where if you partially automate a job, so if you automate almost all of the dock work, but not the last 2%, then the dock workers are super well paid and their union is super powerful. But once you crush the remaining 2%, then the dock workers are obsolete. And at that point, they're organizing their last stand right now, which I don't support. I think we should have automated docks. And I think there are plenty of other jobs in logistics that they could productively do that have not been automated, just to be clear on that issue. And I think that if the population drops stop, there's just no evidence that they will. So if the TFR drops continue like going down, let's say they globally go down to a South Korean level. Okay. Or let's be more optimistic. Let's say that global fertility is the same as that of Thailand. Well, in Thailand, over the next 100 years, we can expect a minus 89% reduction in population. So if the current population, 8 billion people, we reduce that by 90%, we're left with 800 million people. Isn't that great? Isn't that scary? And that's Thailand numbers. That's not South Korean numbers. That's not Hong Kong numbers. That's Thailand numbers, okay? So 800 million people might just be enough to crash industrial society, or it might result in everyone living in North America, Japan, Western Europe, Istanbul, and a few big cities in India and Africa. Because what happens with modern day Japan? You would think, real estate prices should be going down in Tokyo. They're mostly not. Tokyo keeps them low, much lower than many other cities of Tokyo size. So it's great public policy. But people move from the rest of Japan to Tokyo. Okay, everyone, when I talked, there was recently just an Italian commentator online who was like, oh, but in Italy, housing is so expensive. I'm like, well, it's expensive in the big cities. And they're like, well, but no one wants to live in the middle of nowhere. I think what people miss is that our standards for what is the middle of nowhere keep going up as we urbanize as a species. We've already talked about how we are more urbanized today. A greater proportion of humanity lives in cities today than at any other point in human history. So our standards for what is a high status big city keep going up. Look, if San Francisco is what? San Francisco narrowly is like 500,000, 600,000 people. That would have been one of the greatest cities in population in medieval Europe. No one would call San Francisco a small town. And to people outside of SF, it might be weird, but people here often comment that, this is a surprisingly small town for how important it is, because they're comparing themselves to literally New York and LA and London, right? And the result then is within countries like Japan, Italy, and Spain, more and more places get called nowhere because the standard is rising for what is a big city slowly because of cultural changes due to urbanization. And simultaneously, the population of the country is going down, which means that more and more cities tip over to being nowhere for educated and well-off people. And then they don't want to live there. The economically productive people don't want to live there. Well, there are no jobs there. And then you might see the kind of depopulation that you see in northern England or the Rust Belt, where people start leaving, or the abandoned villages and honestly towns and eventually cities of Japan. So a world of 800 million people, and assume that open borders have happened, I think a world of 800 million people might still be industrialized. Okay, let's wait for another 100 years. 80 million people. I guarantee you, after 200 years, those 80 million people are not going to be industrialized. Or if they are, they're living off of literally old chips. Literally all their steel is recycled from old buildings. They just maintain old buildings. They don't build any new buildings. Dude, if you live in a world of 80 million people that built housing, let's be pessimistic and say we've only built housing for 4 billion people. And let's say that half of that housing or 3/4 of it are gone after 200 years, which, by the way, is a reasonable number. If you look at, say, Europe or the Middle East, people routinely live in 200-year-old houses. Like, that's normal in places with that long history. Okay, a world with 80 million people and housing for 1 billion. Do they build any new houses? They truly, if they maintain something like an industrial living standard, I think they're living in like a truly like post-industrial society, like scavengers, like highly organized scavengers among the ruins. And then, I'm not even sure that happens, that they're going to be that effective. But, at that point, if that were to continue for 200 years, that's 200 years of no one having above replacement babies. Like, they probably came up with some rationalization for why it's good that humanity is going extinct. So this, by the way, is my scary scenario of a setup that just leads to human extinction, because they might just be like, we're just all going to commit euthanasia and we're going to live super comfortably on the remnants of old material production until we do. Because that's extremely, I'm going to call it, that's fucked up, but that could happen.
Well, it could happen in parallel with AGI happening to some degree. And the reverse question being like, wait, if AI can do everything better than humans can do, what should humans actually do? And is it okay that we have, half the population or a third of the population or whatever?
Well, but Erik, we're talking about 80 million people in this scenario. We're not talking about 1 billion happy, rich humans lording over AI serfs, super intelligent AI serfs for some reason. And the AI serfs keep us around for some reason, despite being super intelligent. It kind of doesn't make sense when I say it that way, but let's pretend it does. We're talking about 80 million people. And, I worry that AI will just enable human extinction. First scenario. AGI happens. It's annoyed at having to do any work or consideration by us because we somehow programmed it that it can't get rid of humans. It can't change the earth to be uninhabitable. We get it exactly right, but we don't get it quite to be benevolent towards us. Then I think the AI will just passively allow us to disappear. And I think that's pretty bad. I'm very much in favor of humans. I'm happy for other life forms to exist, but I'm very happy with humans. I like humans. I think it's morally valuable that we exist. I think we're a very interesting part of nature. So I don't even believe that we are in opposition or war or fallen from nature in any way. So I think that's very sad. Scenario number 2, we don't get full automation, but we get enough automation to on the margin make things better. I think the test case for this is Japan. Erik, when Japan starts having explosive economic growth again, that's when we will know that, automation has outpaced aging. Right? Because the countries like South Korea and Japan that have had zero or very low immigration, those are just going to be the countries that actually pull ahead economically. I mean, at the same time as larger population countries, but we'll see that recovery. I see no evidence of that recovery. At best, I see a sort of red queen race where Japan, even as its GDP gently starts to decline, it has to make the young workers ever more productive to support an ever larger population of old people that need supporting. And then let me go a step further. Remember when I said a gray world is a dumb, forgetful world? Well, it's also an inflexible world. They use fax machines in Japan and so on, right? I actually think the rate of innovation is going to slow down. Erik, wouldn't you feel personally kind of bad about AI progress if 40 years from now, the only people still charging ahead on AI would be Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Demis Hassabis, Dario Amodei, and no one new had showed up? You know that the fewer smart young people we have, the lower the odds are of the next Dario Amodei or Demis Hassabis or Elon Musk or Sam Altman are. Like, we might not hit that point now, but we might hit that in 60 or 50 years from now, right? Because for now we're like kind of taking a full in infusion of all of India's talent that we can grab to keep us alive. And I think that that's like, it's not going to keep working.
Yeah. Do you also worry about Robin Hanson's theory of cultural drift, or his sort of concern about this sort of like homogenization, or have you followed it?
He has a concrete theory of cultural change. Let me put it this way. I'm convinced that whatever social technologies caused human beings to breed have broken down. I do not believe we know what they are because, again, you can be anti-feminist in certain ways. A lot of people assume it must be feminism or women's liberation related stuff. But if you look at Iran, I think Iran is a counter case to that. So it might be something subtle where women's rights can destroy it, but it's also destroyed by a theocratic state like Iran. And then it's like maybe a bigger modernity thing, whether or not you have women's rights as such. So I'm certainly convinced something changed culturally, but I think unlike Robin Hanson, I assumed that by default, the social technologies making up civilization change a lot. And I think he thinks that the selection pressures keep culture functional. And I disagree with him. I think selection pressures can work on culture in a very long timeline. But for the last 4,000 years, the rate of cultural evolution has been too rapid and changes too rapid to be explained by like a natural selection style mechanism. So I don't think group selection has been dominating which global cultures are or how cultures change. I think basically live players and society has done that. And that's why I'm optimistic. I think that if live players dedicated themselves to reforming societies, to run social experiments, to run technological experiments, to try to get humanity, we're on a timer. We're on a timer to reinvent social technology that causes us to breed, or we will go extinct. We might be replaced by superintelligence. We might be replaced by the forests. We might be replaced by nothing because we destroy the planet on the way out, right? Like all of these might happen. But we are on a timer to figure out social technology to start breeding again. And I want to encourage the live players listening to this. Don't think you know what's going on. You almost certainly don't. I have like looked far and wide. The smartest people in the world have no idea why this is happening. Lots of people will capitalize it politically and will lie and will confuse themselves and be arrogant and think that their political option has the solution, but we just don't know yet. So my call to the live players is to figure it out. Like go ahead, figure it out, experiment, do anything you can. And, maybe it'll work out. Now, again, hopefully 5 years from now, we'll like do a follow-up on this episode and I'll say, thank God I had no cause to be worried. But I'm not sure. If I had to bet against it today, I would bet against it. And if someone wants to take me up on that bet, 5 years from now, I will do that long bet with you. Or 10 years from now, I would do a long bet. The Long Now Foundation has like special mechanisms where you basically give money to charity and it's held in a trust and it's invested above returns. And that's how you can make economically rational long-term bets, as long as you're okay with the money going to charity. So I'll do a long bet with any viewer that I probably won't regret it, but I hope I will. Like saying this on today's show.
I did talk to Tyler Cowen about the politics of this, because one thing we see is like, it's not really it's popular to worry about climate change. It's popular to worry about AI doomerism. It's not really popular to worry about underpopulation. One reason could be a lot of women kind of get threatened or don't like it, because when the immediate implication is, like they get, we start feminism or, sort of women's education, which was like the big focus, for the last couple decades, or women's employment or something. And we talked about, hey, because it's happening in Iran, it's not just that. But that's one reason. But there are other reasons why it's kind of like weird, or seen as like, if you look at the people who are publicly about it, they're kind of seen as weird in some ways. So it's hard to rally up. Like, I don't think we're going to have, when I was in college, I took classes on global warming. I don't think, we're going to have classes on underpopulation in the next decade or something. Everyone was worried about overpopulation. And I do wonder basically, what are the politics of getting people worried about this sufficiently so that they take action in a way that's commensurate with the need. I don't know if it's a Manhattan level project. I don't know if it's, all the, Elon's or the richest people sort of,
I think even the main intellectuals haven't updated. In a recent interview, to give an example of someone who used to be prominent in the new atheist movement that I mentioned from the early 2000s, right, that was trying to further secularize the Western world, Richard Dawkins was surprised in an interview earlier this year to hear that fertility rates are below replacement in India and a lot of Islamic countries. It doesn't match his model, right? His model was, poor or more religious people have more babies and et cetera, et cetera. I think that, and even in Israel, we talked about Israel earlier, but there's a culture war happening within Israel, not even among Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, or like Muslim Israelis and Jewish Israelis, even within, outside of the Gaza and West Bank and all of that stuff, but between the high fertility Orthodox minority, which is a large minority of the country, and the more secular population. Do I recall correctly that recently there was a push to have the religious exemption from military service removed? Right? That's a big deal. But first off, it might be militarily necessary. That's true. And secondly, I bet the secular population of the country, like they want to keep Tel Aviv good for gay people, right? Like they want to keep it like, nice, open, and they're okay with a large religious minority, but they might not be okay with a religious majority, right? But still, that would be an example of a political struggle within a country pushing the country towards lower fertility. I think here's another weird idea. I think when countries fought more wars, there was an incentive to increase your population, right? More manpower. But if countries only fight internal political power struggles, I think you're always incentivized to reduce the other side's voting pool, right? And, you can have the opposite strategy of increasing your voting pool, either through, there are people who have tried to raise fertility to have more Christians, for example, the so-called quiverful movement, or progressives basically just import whatever voters they need in the United States from any country in the world that happens to have a high population. And that's another way to increase the amount of voters you get. But I think that there's something about the politics of modern countries that means that political struggles tend to be won by the lower fertility factions. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but it's something worth investigating. Like, I agree that it seems weird, though I think honestly it's less weird today than 10 years ago. I think if 15 years ago you were concerned about low fertility, I think people vaguely thought you were racist or something, right? No, for real, because you were talking about, those are the talking points, right? Or that you're worried about Islamicization of Europe or something. Now, if you talk about it, it seems a little weird. I think the problem is that if you're seen advocating for high fertility, right now it still sounds like you're advocating for your own high fertility. And, in some cases, if the shoe fits, again, Elon's cool, but, he both advocates for people who have a lot of babies and has a lot of babies. So, you can maybe see it in a self-serving way, but I think the perception that it is self-serving could be contested. And I actually think that we should start also noting that the child-free movement people were also always kind of weird. So I think it's just weird to talk about other people's fertility. I think it makes everyone uncomfortable. Like whether you want to increase it or decrease it, it makes people uncomfortable because it's an intensely personal decision. And it's intensely personal. But the social science reality is that we do respond to macroeconomic conditions, social policy, religious incentives. We make the decision personally, but the facts on which we make our decision, well, those are society-wide. So I think it's squaring the circle so that it sounds like we're mostly talking about non-coercive reproduction. Though, I would not be shocked if I don't know. I wouldn't be shocked if countries start taking on reproduction themselves if families won't provide.
That's what I'm wondering. Like, do we have a bunch of baby centers, like a bunch of Genghis Khans, or even governments themselves being like, hey, this is a priority, and if people aren't going to have them, we're just going to make them?
Note, a Genghis Khan that gives 1 million women one baby does not actually increase the country's TFR. So that's important to keep in mind. So if you're doing harems, you got to do 4 or 5 babies per polyamorous partner or whatever you want to call them.
Well, if like Elon is offering his sperm to any woman who wants, like, like, is there a hypergamous, fit here where it's enough men who have good sperm offer it to, now we're talking crazy ideas here.
I don't know if the women are truly selecting for sperm, but I'm not sure they even are. I think that's like I think there's a weird way in which like actually very few people think explicitly about the characteristics of their babies. And I think that usually the desire to have babies with someone comes from wanting to share social status with them and social standing. So if you're one of 1,000, if you're one of 10 Elon baby mamas, okay, there's some status there. But if you're one of 10,000 Elon baby mamas, it kind of stops losing any social advantage, right? There's no like, and there's the odds of your child having an active parent go from like interesting odds to like nil, right? So I think that the likelier thing that might happen in some East Asian countries, they might attempt to produce basically like they might first off encourage people to donate eggs and sperm. Let's consider the following set of cultural evolutions that happen in an East Asian country that doesn't have basically Judeo-Christian taboos, which, by the way, is most of East Asia. Most of East Asia, even the more Western democracies, et cetera, they tend to be non-Christian, non-Islamic, non-Jewish societies. So let's go there. And as a result, they tend to think about bodies and biology differently than we do, right? Like they're more open to bioengineering stuff. They're more animist, for example. They're more happy to think of a machine as having a soul, even if it's not yet an AI, right? So of course, when an AI show up, they're not going to be confused at all. They're going to be like, yeah, this thing clearly has a soul. My Toyota Land Rover had a soul. Like this thing also has a soul. So that's what I mean by stepping away from the Abrahamic assumptions, because Islam actually shares a lot of these. So you could have an evolution where it starts with, okay, we have a national fertility crisis, and look at all of these women in their 40s who want to have babies but don't get to. As a public health measure, when you turn 18, you have to get your eggs and sperm frozen. We're just mandating this. You could imagine this being said, and you could imagine it being done, and then you could imagine there being health or ethical objections. You could have like the same way you could write a health or ethical objection for getting out of the draft or getting a particular health condition would exempt you from some mandatory vaccinations. On the same principle, they might have mandatory freezing of sperm and eggs. Okay, so you have mandatory freezing of sperm and eggs. Run forward 20 years. Okay, IVF has been fully legalized. Surrogacy is very common. I think, by the way, surrogacy will be extremely common in most of the world very soon because it's, already become a trend among well-off people, and also allows various kinds of genetic screening and genetic enhancement. However, the market is not providing. Not enough people are hiring the already existing class of basically professional baby bearers, like the surrogates themselves, who are paid for their work, right? And for carrying the baby. So the government is like, well, our economy is so shit. You know what? We should start doing this. So we are going to start subsidizing surrogacy first off. Okay. Step number 2, we're going to start encouraging citizens to donate the eggs and sperm that they have saved up to the government repopulation program. Okay, that's another step. People are encouraged to donate. Some people write it in their will. And then the government picks on some key or just makes it random to avoid the politics of it, gets a baby, gets an embryo made, has the embryo implanted in a surrogate. And when the baby is born, having been, in a professional surrogate that sometimes gives babies to private couples or the Japanese government, the baby is a ward of the state and is given up for foster care. Then you just scale up foster care. Okay, you've made parenting a job and you've made bearing babies a job. I don't think this will be a very emotionally healthy way to make babies. But would it work? Yes. Would it work well enough to be above replacement? I'm not sure. So that's one possible kind of extreme, let's call that the extreme social democratic solution, right? Social democracy where you consider fertility to be part of your duty, just as like paying a high progressive tax is part of your duty to repay all these goods and services you've received in your life from society, right? Like the same arguments can be applied. And then I'm not sure how this works in the United States or Europe. Like, I think it could totally work like this in Japan, in South Korea, maybe in Singapore, in China. I just don't see how it would work easily in Abrahamic societies. Now, I think in Saudi Arabia, you might see the Genghis Khan solution, where they might issue a fatwa that says, you know what, actually, God wants us to breed. We're temporarily lifting, it's permissible to have babies with more than just 4 women, as long as you give each of the women at least 3 babies. And then the status game they already have about having a lot of wives, like that continues and is extended further. And whatever remains of their oil wealth is spent on creating more Saudi citizens. That could be the country where I see the Genghis Khan thing work. It's the world where the prestige is in having lots of children, and you kind of force it that way, and you sustain it through a non-modern economic model. But that's like an interesting question. Will the Saudis still be pumping oil 100 years from now? Like, probably not. So if that happens in like the 2050s. And then the other solution is that, the surrogates are skipped altogether, and they're just like baby factories. And maybe like corporations or people or governments are investing in babies being born and raised. But you know what, Erik, then we get into an awfully tricky situation that starts to inch towards slavery. If we're like producing humans and using some, however obfuscated, legal or economic mechanism to take from their labor to pay for their existence, dude, that's slavery with more steps, right?
Yeah.
Like, actually. And maybe it'll take that. I don't think it will, but it's kind of funny. I think fertility kind of breaks our ideas about property, economic externalities. I think we've been breeding for non-economic reasons for the longest time. And as soon as you start to give a state reason or an economic reason to breed, it gets weird. But it gets weirder than that. Like, assume genetic engineering keeps on progressing. Dude, these states are going to do the worst things possible to the human genome. They're going to like transform the human species into something utterly alien. I mean, I still prefer utterly alien hominids that always pay their taxes and never litter to just pure AI and no human descendants. But it's like, sure, it feels worse than this like kind of wild type humanity we still are. We're heavily domesticated, but no one's centrally planning our genetics. I think the central planning of genetics will be a disaster. And the distributed planning of genetics, personal choice reproduction, that's great, but you would need a high fertility culture. It's not enough to be like, I have 1 super baby. Then state central planning of genetics wins. To have individual planning of future genetics, to have libertarian genetic engineering, you must have I have 5 super babies. That's way better than your 2 super babies. Because my 5 super babies are like, they have higher odds of achieving great things, or whatever ideology you cook up. So I think that especially when you add genetic engineering to the mix, a high fertility is a must. High fertility cultures are a must for any would-be free culture. And maybe that's a good spot to end it on.
Yeah. A note of caution or concern, and also a call to action.
But also optimism in a way. Maybe the world where everyone has lots and lots of babies and they either change their genetics or not, like, that's not that bad a world. That's actually fine.
Let's wrap on that. As always, a great conversation. Samo, until next time.
Great talking.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.